So hello, I'm Mateusz Strużyński, Director of the Institute of Classical Philology of Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. And today my guest is an American poet, A.M. Juster, whose real name is Michael Astrue, and whom I invited today to talk to me about his latest book, which is Gerytades. It's a reconstruction of a lost comedy by Aristophanes. And the reason we talk is that this week we have our celebration of Aristophanes at our university. So we had a conference on Monday, international conference dedicated to Greek comedy. And tomorrow we will have public reading of one of Aristophanes's comedies, The Assembly Women. So it's all Aristophanes, but we will not talk only about Aristophanes today, because I would like to start, Mike, by asking you to tell a little bit about yourself to the Polish audience, primarily because they may not be familiar with who you are. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and we can start from that.
So I've really had two careers, or three, depending on how you look at it. So I studied English and philosophy at Yale and intended to be an academic. And I won a major fellowship, and then the university called me in and basically said, "We don't like your politics. We're taking it away from you." And so I actually decided to go into politics as sort of my backup choice. And I worked at senior levels in 4 administrations, 3 Republican, 1 Democratic, and ended up doing a 6-year term as Commissioner of Social Security, about the only commissioner to last any length of time who wasn't actually fired by the president. And I also had a career in biotech, and I was in a company called Biogen. That's one of the big biotech companies in the early days, and then worked for smaller companies. And briefly ran a company that did imaging, which is one of the reasons I'm so interested in Herculaneum and lost texts and that kind of thing. But I was writing poetry on the side, and I took the pseudonym because people in the literary community don't like people that have senior jobs in corporations and government, and people in corporations and government think, doing something serious in the arts is frivolous and you're not serious. So I kept them separate for a long time. I got outed in 2010. One of the unions was determined to drive me out of office, and they had this whole big campaign to find something they could smear me with. And they spent about a year, apparently, couldn't find anything. And then finally they figured out from my financial disclosure forms I was writing poetry on the side. So they released that to a blogger as if that was some horrible scandal, which probably proved that taking the pseudonym made some sense. And nothing bad happened. And then a major journal, First Things, did a very flattering piece about sort of both lives. I took early retirement because I'm fighting 2 autoimmune diseases, and didn't have the stamina to keep working. And so I've been doing poetry pretty much full time since then, which is a little bit over a decade. I edit poetry for a religious journal that's been around for about a century now, called Plow. And I've done a little bit of teaching and that kind of stuff, but mostly I'm writing and translating full time, about 50-50 between writing original poetry and translation. I do a little criticism too, but I'm finding that takes up a lot of time. I find out I usually lose friends every time I do it. So I'm trying to get out of the writing reviews and that kind of thing. So it's poetry and translation for me for the most part.
Interesting. So this combination of politics and poetry is something which for ancient Athenians would not be surprising or inappropriate. And Aristophanes himself, he believed that poetry should make people better citizens and all of that. Yeah. But it's interesting that today it's seen as something completely incompatible. and as you said, from both sides. So politicians would think of poetry as irrelevant, and poets would think probably about politics as being something dirty and not worthy
Yes.
of doing.
Well, the Romans saw it all together too. I mean, you look at Horace's satires, and Horace is walking through the marketplace, and he's being asked to litigate cases. He's being asked to lobby public officials. I think thinking and writing well was viewed as sort of a combination MFA, MBA, MPA, JD. And we've gotten a lot more compartmentalized. And I think that it's gotten to an extreme with poetry in the United States, where when I was young, there were only about 6 MFA programs in the country. And now every college and university has one, and there's
Excuse me, MFA being
a Master of Fine Arts. And so it's where writers go in the United States. And they've sort of prescripted, in order to sort of produce a lot of graduates, they have to make the curriculum easy. And they've, in my opinion, sort of dumbed it down. And we've got a ton of 24-year-olds writing memoirs. We've got poets writing without any real attention to craft or that kind of thing. It's basically again another form of memoir, and I think it's very unsatisfying. And that's why I think poetry in the United States is in decline. Now, if you talk to people in the MFA programs, they'll disagree. They say this is the golden age of poetry, but I think it depends a lot on your perspective. So one of the reasons I connected with Gerytades is I felt that the same way that everybody in the room felt that at the start of the poem, that poetry is in a sad state, and I feel that way about U.S. poetry. So.
Okay, but before we come to your most recent book, I wanted to ask you about your way to being not only a poet but also a translator, and a translator from Latin, which probably will interest the community of classicists in Poland, and not only in Poland, of course, because you published 2 volumes of Latin, ancient Latin classical poetry, so Horace's satires and Tibullus's elegies, and later we will come to other kind of Latin poetry that you also translated, but those are classical collections, Horace and Tibullus. So could you tell us a little bit about your way to Latin, to classics, how you became interested in ancient literature?
So I had mandatory Latin from the time I was 11 till the time I was 16. I didn't really take to it then. We had a very narrow curriculum, which in my opinion was mostly the more boring things. I think they didn't want to corrupt us with what I would consider fun things, but we read a lot of Cicero. We read a lot of the histories. There was a lot of discussion of war and that kind of thing. And I didn't take to it very well. I stopped. I didn't take any classics courses at Yale, but I used the Latin with some regularity because I got interested in medieval literature. Both my wife, I married a classmate, and both my wife and I wrote senior essays on Chaucer, and mine connected my 2 majors, and I wrote on Chaucer and Boethius. So I used it periodically. But then I stopped writing poetry. I got the sort of the kick in the teeth from the Yale bureaucracy and other things. I stopped writing poetry for about 10 years. And then I read Dana Gioia's review of Philip Larkin's Collected, and something kind of connected for me. And I said, boy, I really want to read that book. And I read it. I said, this is really the kind of poetry I think I really wanted to write, but I felt pressure in college to write what was fashionable. And so I set out to teach myself how to write formal poetry, which, in the pre-internet days was kind of hard and took a while. I think today you can do that a lot faster. And so one of the things I started doing to teach myself, really just as an exercise in the beginning, was translation. And I'd work at it, and okay, all right, let's see what, the grown-ups have done. And I started comparing mine and say, I think this stands up pretty well. So I started taking it a little bit more seriously. I started sending it out to significant publications, and they were much more interested in the translations at that point in time than my original work. So I got into it. I needed to gussy up my languages because I hadn't been using them very much. I think French was really actually my best at that point, and I was using French a little bit professionally. But I was a ways away from the Latin. It was a little bit of a struggle to get back to it. But when I got back into it, one of the things that excited me, I figured out at some point that there was all this interesting material that they never taught me, when I was a teenager. And I particularly got interested in post-classical Latin, and I continue to be a big advocate for post-classical Latin. I think it still suffers to today. I sent an edgy note to my friends at Antigone, the online journal. Fellow wrote about post-classical Latin and started talking about, the corrupt language of the Dark Ages. And I just like nails on a blackboard to me, because I think a lot of that reflects anti-Catholic biases of classics professors in the UK in the late 19th century, and that got embraced, by the culture generally. And, the truth is, anybody who studies language knows that language changes and adapts. And the fact that in the 6th century or the 8th century, they weren't writing classic Augustan style, that doesn't really mean very much to me. And I think a lot of extraordinary work and historically important work has been ignored because of this bias. And so I've kind of pulled back from this now, but with the Oldham and the Maximianus, I was I was kind of on fire with those things. But before I got to that, I needed a little bit more confidence. And I started with Horace's satires because I was looking for something that I thought fit my toolbox. And I do write a fair amount of humorous poetry. And I looked at with all due respect to the past translators, I didn't think that they had really provided a definitive version. And it was all in sort of loose free verse. And I thought that in English, our expectations about humor are still, dictated, I think, by Swift and Pope and their imitator, Byron and people, and we expect meter and rhyme. So my Horace translation is the first one in meter and rhyme since the John Connington translation of, I think it's 1869 or something like that, in the 1860s. And I think it works for people because it satisfies those expectations. And I think also having to do it in meter and rhyme forces concision, and particularly for humor. Concision is really important. You draw out a joke, it ought to be a really good joke to be drawn out. So I think it kept it punchier, it kept it livelier. The Tibullus, I think, is there's sort of a long history that I did that originally as a part of a contractual commitment to Penn, and they decided they got one negative review from an outside reviewer who basically said, "You didn't quote my work or the work of my friends," and it was outside the guidelines that Penn had given me for notes, and I thought they would brush it off, and instead they dropped it summarily. So I adopted sort of I'll show you, and I cleaned it up a little bit and took it to Oxford University Press, and they published, and they were great. Oxford was superb to work with. So after I did those two, it was at that point that I started deciding, all right, I want to indulge this interest in post-classical Latin. And I was working on the Oldham and Maximianus simultaneously. There were long delays at the publishers, but I enjoyed that enormously. The Oldham, I wrote commentaries for both of them too, and I needed to do it, particularly for the Oldham, because there hadn't been that much written on a lot of the riddles, and a lot of what was written was really philological in nature, and that's great. But there, in terms of what he was really writing about, what the joke really was, what some of the references were, I needed to fill those in for readers anyway. And at some point, I said, well, I might as well do this right and do a full-blown commentary. And likewise, the Maximianus is very obscure in lots of ways. It's not really clear what his references were. And I'm a big believer in laying out what you do know and what you don't know candidly. And one of the things that often frustrates me in notes or commentaries are writers who think that they know more than they actually do and say, well, this is the way it is. And so I tried to write a different type of commentary. I mean, it is sort of unusual because I really don't have the standard academic background to do that, but I've done it twice and I haven't gotten a lot of complaints. I'm probably not going to do it again. But it was great. Particularly the Oldham was great fun. I mean, it was like a scavenger hunt, of the 8th century, and it was just an enormous amount of fun. So I did those. And I moved away from Latin for a little while, and I did a complete translation of Petrarch's Canzoniere in meter and rhyme, which should be out from W.W. Norton before too long. I actually have a phone call right after this. It's been stalled there, but I think they found a way to unstick it. So I'm hoping to have some good news right after this talk. And in the meantime, I have gone back to the classical era. I'm working on a translation of Sextus Propertius.
Yeah, so Horace and Tibullus are, of course, very different from those medieval writers you mentioned. But what I really like about your translation of Horace, which I read some of it, that it's really accessible and conversational, like a satire should be, and there is a sense of Horace talking to us through the ages, which I think is a very important thing, because sometimes young people and students today they assume that the poetry that is more than 2,000 years old is something which we cannot really relate to, or we have to look at it from our own perspective, from the perspective of our own, problems, concerns. But I think if we have a good translation, which is both humorous and poetical and faithful to the original, we can start a conversation not in the sense that I'm only interested in finding what I want, but I can listen to that voice from the past on its own terms. And so I think it's not just a question of having more translations. It's really very important for people who cannot read Latin, but maybe become fascinated by this other world which looks at you from that verse. So Tibullus is of course different. It's love poetry, but yeah, but I think it's as you said, it's a good way to start. Also because medieval poets, despite those stereotypes, they were conscious of this tradition. Yeah. So
for sure.
People today don't know much about the Middle Ages. That's the biggest problem. That it's just something that people don't know much about. So they assume that there was some huge gap or fissure between antiquity and Middle Ages. Well, of course, things changed, especially in the West, very much in late antiquity and early Middle Ages. But there was a sense of continuity, and of course, we have all those ancient Latin poets only because medieval people were interested in them. They wanted to copy their works, and so I think it's also important in your work that you show this continuity. You also translated John Milton's Latin
Yes, I did.
poetry, right?
Yep.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yep, I did. And as a general matter, I think one of the things that draws me to a poet now to translate, and it took me a while to really find it, is is the voice and feeling that I can capture the voice. And I think Horace was the voice that was easiest for me to capture. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, and this is probably horribly self-serving, but it felt like me in a lot of ways. And I kind of naturally felt that I could do that voice. I had a lot harder time with Tibullus. I finally decided that his voice was the voice of the young James Merrill, um, who was not a fully accomplished poet at that point, had a lot of personal frustrations, that kind of thing, but was still producing this um, gorgeous language. And so that was kind of my reference poet for Tibullus. I'm enjoying the Propertius a lot, and I've hired an editor on my own because I'm finding that presses don't bring in serious editors anymore, a lot of them. So I'm working with one of the great young classicists in the world, Victoria Mall, who also shares my interest in post-classical Latin. But we're working on Propertius together, and I think that the biggest part of the time is figuring out the voice. I think the voice is it's trickier in Propertius, I think, than for some of the others, and it changes. You can go from one poem to another, and it's just sort of the tone and the perspective feels very different. So, certainly, I have plenty of technical errors that Victoria can correct and make suggestions on and that kind of thing. But I think the biggest and heaviest conversations really go more to tone and voice, and it's something I consider important. I think I have an obligation to the original poet to try to get it as right as I can. I know there's a school of thought, and I occasionally argue with people online about this that are kind of take a little bit from Harold Bloom, who was one of my professors at Yale, and tend to view translation as sort of a trampoline for the translator to show his or her creativity. And I don't look at it at all that way. I look at it as I'm like a fiduciary duty, like I'm on a charitable board or something, and you need to do the right thing by the poet, and you need to think, if the poet knew English of our time and was looking at the translation, how would that poet feel about what you're doing to his or her work? And I know that sounds a little corny and may not even be believable for a few people, but in all seriousness, that's really the way I think about it and the way I try to do it.
Hmm. And what sparked your interest in Althelm and Maximianus and those very little known medieval authors? What do you like in their poetry? What excites you about it?
So what happened was when I was working on the first two books, I researched pretty hard. I think excessively by most translators' standards, if only out of insecurities about what I was trying to do. And in the course of that research, I'd come across stray articles about authors I had never heard of. And I started keeping a file. It said basically when I have more time, I'll go and do this. So I'm trying to remember when I finished the Tibullus. It came out in probably finished it 2010, something like that. And then I guess it would have been even earlier than that. I started working on the off my list, and some of the stuff wasn't interesting to me, and some of it wasn't very good. But there's lots of marvelous stuff out there, and more really interesting poetry than I'll ever be able to get to. And I still keep that list. I still keep a list of poets that I want to read and maybe translate someday. And I'll never get to the bottom of that list.
Mm. Yeah. And I also wanted to ask you about about Milton, because I mean, I'm not sure exactly, but I think that there were, of course, various debates within English uh, English language literature, Milton, because he's such a towering figure of English language. So I guess from one perspective, he's just obsolete to some people, right? So he's someone who's I mean, unless you make of, at least in the case of Paradise Lost, unless you make Lucifer his sort of hero, it's impossible to like him, which, as we know, that was not Milton's intention at all. But there seems to be a problem with Milton from this point of view. On the other hand, I think that people, especially now, at least some people, they really want to have sort of national poet or a national figure or poet who would embody a certain tradition and and this continuity of the past. And of course, in English, Milton would be one of the main candidates for it. So I was interested. Uh, what do you think about Milton?
Yeah,
What and yeah.
Milton's one of those poets who in the 20th century, kind of goes in and out of favor. I think the work is sufficiently great and influential that I don't think it will ever go out of the canon. I mean, I think Milton is here to stay. And I think what I found interesting about it and worthwhile for a broader audience is I don't think even very many Miltonists really appreciated how important Milton's own Latin poetry was to him in his youth, and that, he set out very clearly, even one might say a little cold-bloodedly, to make himself be a great poet at a very early age. And at the time he made that decision, in the around 1600, he was unsure, as were a lot of poets in the day, whether if you wanted to last for the ages, whether you wanted to write in English, had to write in English, or whether you would write in Latin. And he, I think, was quite consciously hedging his bets for quite a while. And at some point, by the time maybe he was about 25, I think he decided he wanted to reach the broader audience. So he went with the English. I guess he probably became a little bit more comfortable that it would last for the ages. His first published poem was actually addressed to Shakespeare. It was probably published involuntarily. His father probably, snuck it out and had it published. Is sort of, I think, a pretty good theory. And it may very well be that Shakespeare's spectacular presence was what persuaded him that English was going to be enduring and that one didn't have to write in Latin. But I think if you're interested in his thought and his poetry, you really shouldn't be excluding the Latin poetry, because it was very important to him, and I think it's an important part of his development. And there's a great biography out there. Nicholas McDowell did about 5 years ago a wonderful biography of the young Milton, and apparently the second of what's probably going to be 3 volumes is going to be out fairly soon, i.e., the next year or so. I actually wish that I'd had that biography when I was working on the elegies, because I think it gave me an enormous amount of insight into the young Milton. I mean, I did a lot of research on my own, and so I hit on some of the things that McDowell did, but I've disliked most of the poet biography that I've read, and I've reviewed a lot of them. That's one of the very few that I'm just really enthusiastic about. He did a great job. So I think for me, that one was sort of getting a little bit more into the head of one of the great poets and work that had been largely ignored. And in general, trying to beat the drum for post-classical Latin and remind the Academy and people outside the Academy that, this is work that should be taken seriously, and you shouldn't just be giving it the back of the hand, which I think a lot of Miltonists have done.
Mm. Yeah, and I want to raise another topic, which I think is also interesting and important, namely the question of the form, poetic form, and in terms of verse versus free, free poetry without any particular meter, because if you talk about Horace and Tibullus and those medieval poets that you love so much, and Milton, I mean, it seems that everything differs them, or they are so different from each other, but there is one common factor. I mean, for all of them, poetry has to have some rigorous structure in terms of versification. And when you look at poetry of the 20th century, and I guess also poetry which people are writing now, it's often without that completely. So, and I think it's interesting from various points of view. You can look at it, and so I'm curious, what do you think about the importance of meter, rhyme, and all of those formal aspects of poetry? Because I think it's what was important for me to begin to appreciate it at some point in my life was that it invites you into a different world. So it's you can hear this musical element and rhythm and all of that, and you know that something is important is being communicated to you. So I think it's the act of setting poetry apart from prose and other forms of speech. It's an important act in itself, but that's just one thing that comes to mind. So I'm curious, what do you think, and why do you? Because you also write in verse, right? You're
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah, for the most part, and your translations are also written in verse and formal verse. So why?
Why? Well, I agree with you on the first part, particularly about meter. Meter is, I think, the easiest thing. You have all this poetry where, the form was very important to the poet, and it was part of what went with the poem. It's part of the structure, it's part of the music. And I think if you just throw that overboard, for American free verse rhythms, you've done great violence to the poem before you've even started. So I'm a big believer that if the original was in meter, you need to find a meter that's the equivalent to the contemporary ear. Now, there are extremists on that, and there are people that want to take the exact meter in Latin and duplicate it, and that doesn't work very well. It's a different metrical system. It's based on syllable length, which we can't hear. And even a lot of my classics professors friends usually admit to me they can't hear it either. But in Rome, even the rabble could hear it, because there've been accounts of audiences in the mime plays where a metrical mistake was made in the play, and they would do the equivalent. I can't remember what sound they would make when they were doing the equivalent of booing, but the equivalent of booing, the bad meter. So I think it's really important for the great works of Latin that they be in meter. Typically, I go with iambic pentameter when I'm doing elegy. I do the first line in iambic hexameter, and then the next one in iambic pentameter. And I do find that gives it kind of a pulse rhythm. Hexameter tends to die in English. I mean, I've tried writing in hexameter. It doesn't work very well. And even if you back someone who's an enthusiast about hexameter to say, well, what are the great English poems that are written in hexameter? Well, there really aren't very many. So usually iambic pentameter as at least part of the solution, makes some sense. When I've been translating epigrams, um, and I did a fair amount of Marshall at one point, and Ausonius, who I also think I love, and I think it's a greatly overlooked poet, and others over the years. I've been looser, more anapestic, because that's, for a two-liner, the ear in English kind of actually expects a little bit of anapestic rhythm. And often I'll make the punchline, second line, a little shorter than the first, because that's what works from a humor point of view, kind of the boom on it. The question about rhyme is a little bit trickier. As much as I love rhyme, I've read some rhymed translations of Propertius, and they're just, for me, they're like nails on a blackboard. It doesn't seem to fit, what's being said. And so for me, I restrict my use of rhyme in Latin translations basically to humor, or something that's close to humor. I mean, satire, riddles, those kinds of things. And I don't use it in the elegies. I don't translate epic. I've toyed with doing a very obscure late antique epic, but I don't think I'll ever get to that. But if I were to do it, I would not try to rhyme it. I would do it in iambic pentameter. And do it, try to achieve, going back to the previous question, really trying to achieve probably the same kind of effects that Milton was making in Paradise Lost, but just with more contemporary language.
Mm. Mm. And for your most recent book, Gerytades, you picked heroic couplets.
Yes, and that goes back to my point in that, for me it's comedy. People are supposed to laugh, and I don't know what it's like in Polish, but I know in English and most of the Romance languages, the expectation of humor is that it rhymes, and that part of driving a great punchline home is a wonderful rhyme, at the end of it. So you get the wonder of the incongruity being resolved, but then you also get the unexpected rhyme that drives it home, and it's just the real beauty, to that. And it's been our expectation for centuries. And even with the kind of the assault of modernism on form, the modernists haven't done a great job with humor. I mean, if you say what's the great modernist achievement in humor in English poetry, and people are going to be looking at their shoes for a very long time. So, I basically went for the safe and the proof. It's heroic couplets. My feeling is it was good enough for Alexander Pope and Boileau and other, writers of humorous poetry, that it was good enough for me. And I like it. I mean, it's fun to do. And, the amazing thing about this project, it's gotten a lot of interest in this book, and it was very unexpected to me, because, I was looking to do a couple fun things after 2.5 years of really doing nothing except Petrarch every day, 8 to 14 hours a day, right through the weekends. And I did that for 2.5 years during the pandemic. And I only took 30 days off in those 2.5 years. That was all to visit grandchildren. And I wanted to do something different and fun. So I had two projects. So I wrote my first children's book. And to my surprise, that got picked up very quickly, and that will be out almost exactly a year from now. A book called Gerytades, about the adventures of a small female juvenile manatee, one of these big mammals that swims around in Florida. And then I started working on Gerytades, and I kind of thought it was kind of a goof for a while, that I was really just sort of entertaining myself, but I was having such great fun that I didn't really mind that, I didn't think it would see the light of day. And I didn't send it around for publication, but I mentioned it online. And these wonderful folks at Contubernales Press kind of raised their hands and said, we'd be interested in that.
Yeah.
And they've been wonderful. And they're a press that your folks should pay attention to, because they're two young classics teachers in Delaware who decided that classics books for instruction for junior high and high school students were way too expensive, and it was keeping great work from being taught. So most of their focus is doing inexpensive versions of the classics, and they do a very good job at that. So this is sort of a one-off for them. I gather this is their big seller right now, and I'm still totally stunned by that, but very happy about it. And I guess maybe it's just because it's something new in a world where you don't see much that's new. But I've had a great time writing it. I got some nice help from some of my colleagues refining it. I think the big step was kicking out the clunky introduction and writing the prologue instead, and I've become fond of the prologue. Oh, by the way, for people who are listening who want to check this out before making the full $10 investment in the book, my friends at Orion, the wonderful classics journal out of Boston University, are, I think in the next few weeks or so, are going to run an excerpt of the first 100 lines, the prologue, and then a chunk afterwards. And that will give, I think, almost anybody a pretty good sense of what it's going to be like. And hopefully, if you hear the beginning of the story, you want to figure out how it ends. So, so we'll see.
Yeah. So the point of departure is that we know that Aristophanes wrote a comedy entitled Gerytades, and that it was about poets going into Hades in order to save poetry, right? Rescue poetry, and the motive, the literary motive that there are no good poets anymore, so we have to find them somewhere. It can be found also in other comedies of that period,
Yes.
and most notably in Frogs, where
Yes.
it's all about bringing back either Aeschylus or Euripides, so tragic poets. Yeah.
I reread the Frogs in order to do this, and that also influenced my choice of the speaker for the prologue.
Yeah. Who is Euripides?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but we don't really know what this lost play was about. So it was just free play of imagination here.
For the most part, I mean, what I tried to do, because I knew that there would be classicists who would be interested, maybe even critical, and so I tried to be meticulous about what I knew and what I didn't know, and to try to be generally apologetic about the whole endeavor. So, unlike with most humorous poetry, there are notes, and so to the extent that the lines are building on something that we know from secondary sources, the inspiration for the book originally. So my friend Jeffrey Henderson, who runs the Venerable Loeb series, published a number of books for lost plays, other lost texts, of fragments and from secondary sources, sometimes direct quotations, sometimes just sort of descriptions of what's going on. And there's some for, right. So I don't think I was flying totally blind. So there's a description by Athenaeus that I'll just read it to you. It's quick. And Aristophanes selects slender men, the tragic poet Cinerion, and Meletus and Canisius, whom he says were sent by the poets down there, and he calls them Hades haunters, whom he says were also riding on slender hopes. So that quotation was one of the ones that really got me going, thinking, well, okay, I can kind of figure out what the premise is here. And I think you can figure out more about the premise than the rest of the book. So that there's a gathering of poets, in the beginning. And I've sat through those kind of things. They're tedious and they're awful, and there's a lot of bad behavior and that kind of stuff. So I'm assuming that Athens um, was no different from meetings after the Association of Writers and Writings programs in the United States. So that was kind of easy for me. And there's several. You get the names of the three primary figures. They're stock figures. You've got a drunk, you've got a tragedian, that kind of thing. And I accepted this sense that they were sent on a mission to Hades because I also, it fit the pattern of thought because of the frogs. And as I thought about it a little bit more, I mean, the interesting thing is there's almost nothing in the Henderson fragments that tells you anything personally about Gerytades. But you have to assume that he's a major figure, or else the play wouldn't be named after him. And so, thinking about it, these guys are sent on a mission, probably one that they weren't enthusiastic about. What's missing? Well, it's got to be a protagonist who's the one that pushes them into doing it. And so that's, conjecture on my part, but I think a fairly reasonable one. And so I feel pretty good about the beginning. There's some difference of opinion in the literature as to who they were told to go retrieve. It gave me a lot of pause for thought that Jeff Henderson was not in the Orpheus school, that he had another candidate, but
goddess poetry.
Yes. And I just found that I connected much more to Orpheus. And as I explained in writing a little bit recently, I did a piece on this poem for Antigone. And, from my mourning for lost works of poetry, one of the ones that's always been close to my heart for 15 years, has been Lucan's Orpheus. And my poet Aldhelm, who I translated, is the source of what is allegedly the only quotes from Lucan's Orpheus. But it was still, for me, almost intoxicating that, you'd get into the 7th century and there was still at least one copy of Orpheus floating around. Now, I'm grown up enough that I realize might very well have been a fake, and that might not really have been a real copy. But I've always had sort of this dream about, maybe that will show up in some monastery someplace or some, English great house or something like that. And so I think I didn't really make a scholarly decision to pick one over the other. I just sort of said, it seems to be what we would call in America a jump ball, where basketball players are trying to get control of a ball. And for me, Orpheus really connected, and somehow Goddess of Poetry I didn't get my juices flowing the same way. So really for emotional, non-scholarly reasons, I went with Orpheus.
That's very interesting, because Orpheus is, well, he's obviously a fitting figure to embody poetry, but also I think the figure of Orpheus points to certain aspects of poetry which are again today are not prominent anymore. So poetry as magic, right? So poetry as this, it's not something which is listened to or written just for fun, just for pleasure, entertainment, but poetry is this deeply metaphysical and religious power descending from above, and capable of capable nature. Like animals were, and the whole nature and plants and animals were listening to Orpheus's singing. But then poetry was so powerful that it could even cheat death to a certain extent. And here's, of course, the crux of the matter, so that ultimately Orpheus couldn't save Eurydice. That so there is the sadness and the sense of loss and grief, which is an important part of any poetry, I think. And
I agree with all of that. You've said it better than I could say myself. And the only thing I would add is also Orpheus um, with music. And for me, the sadness of contemporary poetry being stripped of most of its music is a hard thing. So I think that was added into the calculus. So I felt pretty good about the beginning, and then I started thinking about the end. Well, what does a goofball trip into Hades look like? And I struggle with that a lot longer. There's not as much, aren't as many shreds that tell you what's going on there. But it seemed to me from the setup that it had to be a failure. That they couldn't go in there and really succeed in bringing Orpheus back. That would be against, I think, the setup. And so then I started thinking, well, how does it fail? And I did a lot of reading to learn or remind myself what Hades was like. And I realized that there's relatively little action on the near side of the river. You cross the river, then literally all hell is breaking loose, we would say in English. And it gets a lot more complicated, probably more complicated than the story needed to have. So I decided that they couldn't cross the river. It seemed to me that the obvious comic excuse for not being able to cross the river was not having money. And then I, played around with, well, why didn't they have money? Did they forget? Did something happen to their money? That kind of thing. And that goes back to the kind of the middle of the play. I mean, I did spend some time looking at, well, how long did it take in those days to get from Athens to the southern tip of Greece, and how were they likely to be doing that? And I didn't come to sort of firm conclusions about that, but decided that it wasn't a day trip. And so I decided to create an inn where they could stop, and eventually created a second inn right at the mouth of the gates to hell, so that have a little time for a little action and comic entertainment, and not rush the story, sort of too much. There's no shred in any of the evidence to support the two ends, but the first inn allowed me to create the premise that's common in a lot of subsequent comedy, that these sort of immoral, amoral poets go and have some raunchy adventures and aren't paying real attention, and they lose their cash, while doing that. And so that seemed to be a fairly time-worn premise that I don't think Aristophanes would be terribly offended by. And so that's the excuse for that. And otherwise, when they're in Hades, I tried to stick on the near side to, things like Cerberus and that, things that are generally recorded as being on the near side. Those things show up, and I didn't import anything, from the other side. So I did try to stay faithful in that sense, even though there's not a lot of specific evidence in the Henderson book, to back that up. And then, at some point just decided not to worry about it too much, that Aristophanes would want people to have fun and have it be a good story, and just felt like I was being encouraged to connect the things that I thought I knew had to be there with that in just some way that made it plausible and funny. And so it's mostly me. But the key foundational elements, I did work pretty hard to put as much Aristophanes in there as I possibly could.
Mm. Yeah, and the interesting point is, as you said, that this whole adventure ends in a failure, and it's a failure to rescue poetry, or it's a failure to find a solution to the crisis of poetry. And obviously you want to say something about our day and age, not
Yes.
about the 5th or 4th century BC Athens. So, is this like a comic expression of your like, deep pessimism about the role poetry is assigned today in the West?
Well, I don't think of myself as a pessimist. I think of myself as an almost laughable optimist because I keep going, in ways that, they're teaching in schools in the United States that everything I do and believe strongly in is dead and nobody should learn how to do it and all that kind of stuff. And, I keep rolling along and keep going. So I'm an optimist in that way. And I also think, I do blame the academic institution in the United States for doing horrible things to poetry. A lot of these things didn't happen until the MFA programs really, controlled the journals and the education of poets, and it's really become like a guild now that you're not even a real poet unless you have an MFA degree, and I think all that is awful. But I also stay an optimist not only because I think it's my general disposition, but I've come around, even though I was pushed onto the internet very reluctantly by friends who told me that if I didn't do it and raise my profile a little bit, nobody would publish my poetry anymore. But I've come around to the belief that the internet creates a great possibility to bring poetry back to the people. And that started in a way that's not entirely pretty. So we have in the United States, I guess around the world, really, this phenomenon of Insta poetry, poetry that's posted on Instagram, which is short and very new agey and generally makes me cringe. But the poets who are writing that, who are popular, they're selling, millions of books, and they're reaching people. And none of it is through the normal literary establishment and their institutions. And so I continue to think that people who think a little bit more like me, if we get creative in terms of using the tools of the internet, can circumvent the academic gatekeepers, find audiences out there that are right now just annoyed and not paying any attention to poetry at all, and bring them back and have them loving poetry the way that poetry had a huge audience in this country in the 1950s and 1960s. Poets were celebrities. They were on game shows, not even like the most famous two or three, but the next tier down. And I think that's all possible. I don't know that I'm smart enough to do it or I'm going to live long enough to do that, but I think it's doable. And I think it's worth getting up every day and trying to make sure that it happens. So I see myself as an optimist, not a pessimist.
Yeah, that's good. And you said that the internet, apart from obvious downsides, creates also opportunities for good things, like you mentioned. Yeah, and so yeah, I thought that it also created an opportunity for us to have this talk because of your piece for Antigone and and the fact that we could talk across the Atlantic about well, poetry and Latin and Aristophanes and all of that. So I want to thank you for your work on Latin poetry, for your translations, and for bringing ancient and medieval literature into the focus of our time, because I think it's essential. It's what we're trying to do with Antigone as well. So not to give up, but try to show people that this is beautiful, this is interesting, this is good, this is fun to read, and yeah. So in that sense, I think we can be optimists, even though even though in your reconstruction of Aristophanes, the whole project ended a failure, but it doesn't mean that we will fail.
Well, you also, you don't know quite for sure. So because you get to the end and and this goes into maybe some of my biases too, they're talking about trying to write the great epic poem, at the end, based on their experience. And of course, in order for it to be a great epic poem, they have to totally lie about their experiences. But, that happens. I've had the experience, you know, having worked in senior roles for four presidents. I've read history books that describe events that I was there at the table. And I've yet to read one that's at all accurate. So I've become much more of a skeptic about, histories generally. But you don't know at the end of Gerytades that at some point, all these bad experiences might be the fuel that gets them, the fame and the praise that they long for. Now, I developed, they became people to me. And so I still kind of look at them and say, no, I don't think they're going to be able to pull that off. But, you don't know. And I think that's okay. I think that's an ending that Aristophanes would have liked.
Yeah. So on that note, let's end this conversation. Thank you, Mike, very, very, very much for agreeing to talk to me. And
no, I appreciate the opportunity very much, and really the support in the classics community. I mean, Antigone's been great, Orion's been great. All these journals that are working to bring classical literature to broader audiences, they've been very supportive of this project. So I've been really, really happy about that.
Okay, so thank you, and good luck for your
Thank you very much.
many
Take care.
projects. Yeah, bye bye.